3 bullets. That's all it took to change everything. The sound echoed through the airport, bouncing off the polished walls and sending passengers screaming in every direction. A black woman collapsed to the floor, her shoulder bleeding, her breath uneven. People didn't know who she was. To them, she was just another traveler. Another target caught in the crossfire of security. But here's the twist no one expected. That woman wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just a bystander. She was a federal judge. And within minutes, she would do something that would shake the entire system to its core. What happened next ended the careers of the very men who tried to end her life. The story starts at Charlotte Douglas International Airport on what was supposed to be an ordinary day. Judge Noelle Whitaker, calm, dressed in her usual black blazer, bag in hand, stepped into the TSA line just like everyone else. She had spent her life upholding the law, writing rulings that carried the weight of the Constitution. But on that morning, all of that meant nothing. To the officers watching her, she wasn't a judge. She was just another black body to be scrutinized. She handed over her ID. The officer looked at it, then at her face and then back at the ID. Something in his eyes shifted, suspicion, not recognition. "Step aside," he muttered. Passengers behind her shifted impatiently. Noelle complied without protest. She had traveled enough times to know the drill. Random checks. Extra scans. The random that somehow always seemed to land on the same kind of people. But this time was different. Another officer joined in. They questioned her, their tone sharp, their words clipped. Her bag was pulled, her hands swabbed, her patience tested. Still she stayed calm. She had endured worse. She thought it would end there. Then came the command. "Ma'am, place your hands where we can see them." Noelle froze, confusion flickering across her face. "Excuse me. Hands. Now." She raised them slowly, her voice steady. "I'm complying. What exactly is the issue?" The officer's hand moved toward his weapon. Passengers gasped. Phones came out. A teenager nearby whispered, "They're really about to shoot her." And then, bang, bang, bang. The shots rang out, sharp and merciless. Noelle fell back, blood staining the tiles beneath her. Panic tore through the terminal. People screamed, ducked, ran. But in the chaos, one thing didn't disappear. The phones. Dozens of recordings captured what had just happened. And within hours, those recordings would spread across social media like wildfire. #JusticeForNoelle began trending before she even reached the hospital. Twitter threads exploded with outrage. TikTok edits replayed the moment in slow motion, captions flashing. She was unarmed. She was compliant. She was shot. But the truth, the piece that turned this into more than another headline, was revealed later that same day. Because while the world debated who she was, while the airport issued its incident under review statement, Judge Noelle Whitaker walked into her courtroom, bandages on her shoulder, pain radiating through her body, and still she sat behind the bench. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps. Cameras pointed, questions screamed, but she didn't flinch. She knew exactly what she had to do. The officers who shot her thought they were ending a threat. Instead, they had ignited a case that would end their own careers. Inside that courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Attorneys whispered to each other. Journalists typed furiously. Everyone was waiting for her to speak. And when she did, her words were like knives. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This court will not ignore what happened," she said. "The question is not whether I was shot. The question is whether this system will admit that it has been shooting at people like me for years, and calling it protocol." Gasps echoed. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunshots had been. Because in that moment everyone realized, this wasn't just about one judge. This was about a system of profiling, abuse, and unchecked power. And for the first time, the system had shot the wrong person, someone with both the platform and the will to fight back. Phones lit up again. Reporters live-tweeted her every word. And by the end of the day, the headline had shifted. It was no longer passenger shot at airport. It was, federal judge turns shooting into career-ending trial for officers. But this was only the beginning. Because if you thought walking back into court bleeding was shocking, wait until you hear what she did next. The courthouse was packed the next morning. People who had never set foot in a courtroom before were squeezing into the benches, their eyes fixed on the woman who had survived 3 bullets just hours earlier. Judge Noelle Whitaker walked in slowly, her arm in a sling, her steps careful but steady. She wasn't hiding her wounds. She was showing them. And that choice alone carried a weight no jury instruction could ever match. The officers who shot her were there too, Doug Hannity and Mark Briggs, sitting stiff in their pressed uniforms, their lawyers whispering frantically beside them. Just days earlier, they had walked through airports barking orders, their badges giving them unchecked power. Now those same badges were evidence. Noelle didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Her focus was on the people who had gathered to see if justice was more than just a word. The first witness called was Maya Carter, a young TSA officer who had been working the checkpoint that day. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. "Tell the court what you saw," Noelle instructed, her voice calm even. Maya swallowed hard. Judge Whitaker complied. She placed her hands where they could see them. She didn't resist. She didn't raise her voice. There was no threat. The defense attorney jumped up. Objection. Speculation. Noelle fixed him with a stare. Overruled. She was there. Continue. Maya nodded, her voice growing stronger. When Officer Hannity reached for his weapon, I thought, no, I knew it was wrong. That's why I pressed record on my smartwatch. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense scrambled, whispering furiously. Noelle leaned forward slightly. "You're saying you recorded the incident?" Maya lifted her wrist, showing the device. "Yes, Your Honor. I sent the file to my private drive. It's untouched." The prosecution smiled for the first time that morning. "Your Honor, we'd like to enter Exhibit A, the unedited recording of the shooting, from less than 3 feet away." The projector flickered to life. The room fell silent. On screen, the grainy but clear footage played. Hannity's voice barked commands. Noelle's calm replies echoed back. And then, without warning, the muzzle flash. The sound of 3 bullets tearing through the air. The sight of a black judge collapsing to the floor. The courtroom erupted. Some people covered their mouths. Others muttered curses under their breath. Phones buzzed as snippets of the video were live-streamed by journalists in the gallery. Within minutes, the hashtag 3 bullets was trending worldwide. But the most haunting moment wasn't the gunshots. It was what came after. Hannity's voice, captured on Maya's recording, muttered under his breath. "Should have stayed in her place." Noelle didn't flinch. She simply let the silence linger, letting every person in that courtroom feel the ugliness of those words. The defense attorneys looked pale. Their strategy had been to frame the shooting as a split-second decision, a tragic but excusable error. But the recording destroyed that narrative. It wasn't a mistake. It was contempt. Outside, the protests grew larger. Crowds gathered with signs reading "Justice for Noelle." And how many more? News vans lined the block, anchors broadcasting live. TikTok clips of the recording hit 1 million views in under an hour, stitched with captions like, "Imagine shooting a judge and thinking you'll get away with it." But while the public was exploding with outrage, Noelle kept the proceedings steady, methodical. She wasn't just seeking punishment. She was building something larger. During cross-examination, she turned to Maya. "Officer Carter, why did you decide to risk recording this, knowing you could face retaliation?" Maya hesitated. "Because I couldn't let it disappear. I've seen complaints vanish. Reports buried. I knew if I didn't save it, it would be like it never happened." Noelle nodded. That courage may have saved not just me, but the truth itself. Her words spread like wildfire online. Screenshots of the transcript hit Twitter. Commenters wrote, "She's not just fighting for herself. She's fighting for every voice that's ever been silenced." And just like that, the case wasn't just about Noelle anymore. It was about a system of silence, of buried complaints, ignored victims, and unchecked power. But the officers weren't giving up quietly. Their lawyers pivoted, arguing that Noelle had escalated the situation by questioning authority, by not immediately dropping to her knees. It was a desperate move, and it backfired. Because the more they argued she should have surrendered her dignity, the more the public saw the truth. No amount of compliance had ever been enough. By the end of the second day, the officers were no longer being defended in the court of public opinion. Their own police union released a lukewarm statement distancing itself. Politicians who once praised them now avoided mentioning their names. Still, the danger wasn't over. Noelle knew better than anyone that public outrage didn't always translate into justice. She had seen cases collapse under technicalities, seen guilty men walk free because the system preferred its own comfort over the truth. So she made a choice. The next morning, before testimony resumed, she brought 14 sealed letters into the courtroom. She placed them on the bench, their weight undeniable. "These," she said, "are complaints filed against airport officers across the country. 14 lives disrupted. 14 voices ignored. Today, they will be entered into the record." The gallery erupted again. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail. The letters, once hidden in bureaucratic darkness, were now public, undeniable, irreversible. The officers' lawyers objected, shouting about irrelevance and procedure. But Noelle overruled them calmly. "This is not just about one incident. It is about a pattern. And the pattern will be seen." Once again, the story broke online. Hashtags shifted from #3bullets to #14voices. People began sharing their own stories, tweets, videos, threads about profiling and humiliation at checkpoints. It wasn't just Noelle's fight anymore. It was everyone's. And yet, the officers still clung to their defense. Their fate hung in the balance. The question was no longer, did they shoot her? Everyone had seen the video. The question was, would the system protect them, or would it finally, for once, hold them accountable? And Noelle was about to force that answer. The courtroom felt heavier with each passing day. By the third morning, there weren't just reporters and locals in the gallery. There were senators' aides, lobbyists, even representatives from federal agencies. The case had outgrown Charlotte. It was now national. Judge Noelle Whitaker knew exactly what that meant. The stakes weren't just about Hannity and Briggs anymore. They were about whether America itself would admit the truth, that racial profiling wasn't an accident, but a pattern as old as the uniforms those men wore. The prosecution called its next witness, a security contractor named Samuel Ortiz, who had worked at airports for over a decade. His testimony was blunt. "I filed 3 reports," he said, his voice steady but tired. 3 different times I saw officers pull aside passengers with no cause other than their skin color. I wrote it down. I submitted it. And every time it disappeared. I stopped filing because I knew nothing would change." The defense lawyer tried to discredit him. "So you're saying you stopped following procedure?" Ortiz leaned forward. "No, sir. I'm saying the procedure stopped following me." The room buzzed. Tweets shot out instantly. "Procedure stopped following me," chilling line from witness in Whitaker trial. Clips circulated online, stitched with the footage of Noelle being shot. Outside, the protests grew louder. Students, activists, parents, veterans, people who had all felt the sting of being profiled, filled the streets with chants. One sign summed it up perfectly. "If they can shoot a judge, what chance do we have?" The system was on trial and the world was watching. But the officers' defense still clung to their argument. Split-second decision. Their lawyer painted a picture of chaos, fear, confusion, that Hannity and Briggs had only seconds to react, that any reasonable officer could have made the same choice. Noelle didn't let that narrative stand. She leaned into the microphone. "Let me be clear, I was standing still. My hands were raised. I asked a question. If asking a question is enough to justify 3 bullets, then every black traveler in this country is in danger." Gasps. Murmurs. Hashtags exploded again. #asking is not a threat. TikTok clips looped her words against images of passengers with their hands up at checkpoints. But her statement did more than fuel outrage. It forced lawmakers to react. Within 48 hours, congressional leaders were on television, dodging questions. Some promised reforms. Others dismissed it as a tragic misunderstanding being politicized. That divide only poured gasoline on the fire. Back in court, the prosecution unveiled the 14 letters Noelle had introduced. Each one was read aloud. Each one told the same story. Humiliation, suspicion, fear. Mothers with children. Students traveling to debate tournaments. Elderly men pulled aside without reason. The courtroom wasn't just listening. They were feeling. And outside, so was the nation. Social feeds filled with people posting their own travel stories, using the #MyCheckpoint. Thousands of voices, all echoing the same truth. For Hannity and Briggs, the walls were closing in. Their lawyers tried a new strategy. Attack Noelle herself. For Hannity and Briggs, the walls were closing in. Their lawyers tried a new strategy. Attack Noelle herself. Your Honor, one sneered during cross-examination, don't you think it's a conflict of interest to preside over a case in which you were personally involved? The gallery tensed. Was this the moment they'd try to flip the case? Noelle didn't raise her voice. Normally, yes. But this is not a normal case. This is not about me. This is about a system that thought it could bury the truth, even when the truth was bleeding on an airport floor. And I will not allow it to be buried again. The courtroom erupted in applause before the bailiff restored order. Outside, her words blasted across cable news. One network anchor said, "She's turned the courtroom into a reckoning." Another said, "This is dangerous territory. She's blurring the line between judge and activist." But to the people, she was something more, proof that someone inside the system was finally willing to fight it. And the pressure didn't stop at the courthouse. The Department of Justice announced it was reviewing airport security nationwide. Airlines scrambled to issue statements about bias training. The union representing TSA officers called for calm, but privately scrambled to cover itself. Every day the case dragged on, the more cracks appeared in the foundation. Yet Noelle knew how fragile this all was. Outrage burned bright, but it could fizzle just as quickly. The system had a way of waiting people out, delaying, stalling, exhausting them until the world moved on. So she doubled down. One evening, long after court adjourned, she sat at her desk and drafted what she would call the accountability motion. It wasn't just about Hannity and Briggs. It demanded that all misconduct complaints against TSA and airport police be entered into a public, searchable database. No more buried reports. No more vanished voices. The next morning she filed it. The defense lost its mind. "This is unprecedented. This is judicial activism," they shouted. Noelle didn't blink. It is justice. And justice is always unprecedented to those who have avoided it. That single line lit up the internet again. Memes edits, quotes, her face next to the caption. Justice is always unprecedented to those who have avoided it. Even celebrities joined in, retweeting the clip. Suddenly it wasn't just activists and lawyers paying attention. It was the entire cultural conversation. But with visibility came risk. That night, Noelle's staff found a letter slipped under the courthouse door. "Step down now, or next time there won't be just 3 bullets." The threat spread online after it leaked. Some said it was proof she was hitting a nerve. Others worried for her safety. But Noelle didn't step back. If anything, it made her more determined. By the end of the week, the trial had transformed into something larger than any courtroom. It was a movement, a demand, a roar too loud to ignore. And everyone knew the climax was coming. The question wasn't if Hannity and Briggs would fall. The question was, would they fall alone, or would the whole system finally start to crack? The courthouse steps looked more like a protest ground than a legal venue now. Every morning when Judge Noelle Whitaker arrived, chants rose up from the crowd, signs waving above heads. No more hidden bullets. Justice at the checkpoint. If they can shoot her, they can shoot us. Camera crews lined the street, capturing her every step. She didn't wave, didn't smile for the lenses. She walked straight ahead, her arms still bound in a sling, her eyes set on the courtroom doors. Inside, the pressure mounted. The prosecution had shown the video. They had exposed the words "should have stayed in her place." They had read the 14 letters of ignored complaints. But the defense wasn't done. They had one last move. Drag Noelle herself into the mud. "Judge Whitaker," the defense attorney began, his tone dripping with forced politeness, "you've made yourself the face of this case. But isn't it true you've been criticized before for being too sympathetic in cases involving race?" The gallery hissed. Noelle didn't flinch. "I've been criticized for applying the law evenly regardless of race. If that looks like sympathy, then perhaps it's the critics who need to examine their biases." The attorney smirked. "And isn't it true you stand to gain public recognition from all this outrage? That you're leveraging a tragedy for your own image?" Noelle's reply was razor sharp. "If I wanted recognition, I would have retired quietly and signed a book deal. I chose instead to sit in this chair, with 3 bullets still in my shoulder, Because this court matters more than my reputation. Now ask your next question. Applause broke out before the bailiff silenced the gallery. Online, clips of her response spread like wildfire. The hashtag shifted again. Hashtag ask your next question. People used it to call out corruption, bias, and evasions everywhere, not just in airports but in workplaces, classrooms, even politics. The courtroom had become more than a trial. It was a mirror, and America didn't like what it saw. But with every wave of public support came an equal wave of backlash. Cable news debates framed her as reckless, biased, too emotional to preside. One headline blared, "Is Judge Whittaker destroying the system she's meant to protect?" Anonymous calls flooded the courthouse. Some threatened violence. Others sneered, "We'll bury you like you buried them letters." Noelle refused extra security, not because she thought she was untouchable, but because she refused to let fear dictate the ground she stood on. Still, her staff worried. Tyrese, the young clerk who had been documenting the trial, whispered to her one evening, "Judge, people are scared. They're scared for you." Noelle's eyes softened. Good. Fear means they know this fight matters. Back in court, the prosecution called its final witnesses, victims from the letters themselves. Each one walked slowly to the stand, carrying years of silence in their voices. A college student recalled being pulled out of line on the way to a scholarship interview, treated like a suspect, missing her flight, losing her chance. A father recounted being cuffed in front of his children for acting nervous. The memory etched into his kids' eyes forever. A grandmother described her humiliation when officers rifled through her wig, laughing as passengers stared. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin of split-second decision. These weren't accidents. They were patterns, habits, a culture. By the time the last witness stepped down, even some jurors looked shaken. The defense tried to fight back. They argued Noelle was turning the trial into a circus, that this was no longer about two officers but about every officer. Noelle leaned forward, her voice steady. "Yes, that's exactly what this is about. Because every officer holds the same power. The power to humiliate, the power to harm, the power to kill. And unless this system changes, it will happen again." The gallery roared with approval. Outside, the chants grew louder. Social feeds lit up. She said it out loud. She named it. Hashtag power to kill. Politicians scrambled. Hearings were announced on Capitol Hill. Analysts predicted mass resignations within airport security. Some called her a hero. Others called her dangerous. But no one ignored her. Then came the twist no one saw coming. On the seventh day of testimony, Hannity himself asked to speak. His lawyer begged him not to, but he insisted. He took the stand, his face pale, sweat dotting his forehead. "I never meant to," he stammered. "I never meant to shoot her." His eyes flickered toward Noelle. "But when she looked at me, I didn't see a judge. I don't know. I just reacted." The gallery gasped. Online, the clip spread instantly. "I didn't see a judge." Commentators shredded him. "So who did you see?" One anchor demanded on live TV. "What image was so threatening that a black woman with her hands raised became your target?" It was the confession he didn't realize was a confession. He had admitted it wasn't about a weapon or danger or training. It was about perception, warped bias, deadly perception. Noelle didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply said, "Your words speak for themselves." And then the prosecution rested. Outside, the protests swelled into something unstoppable. Not just hundreds. Not just thousands. Tens of thousands across the country, chanting her name, holding signs with her face next to the words. Justice is always unprecedented to those who have avoided it. But inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. The jury was about to deliberate. The world was about to hear whether accountability would finally win, or whether the system would protect its own once again. The stakes were clear. If the jury let Hannity and Briggs walk, it would tell every officer in America they could pull the trigger without consequence, even against a federal judge. If they found them guilty, it would be the crack in the wall so many had been waiting for. And Noelle knew. This verdict wasn't just about her. It was about the line between dignity and despair for millions of people who had lived her story in smaller, quieter ways. The courtroom lights flickered as the jury filed out to begin deliberation. No one moved. No one breathed. The question hung over every head, every camera, every phone streaming live. Would the system finally choose justice? Or would it once again choose silence? The jury room door closed, and with it time seemed to freeze. The crowd outside the courthouse grew restless, chanting louder with every hour that passed. News anchors filled airtime with speculation. Social media lit up with polls, hashtags, live streams. Millions of people holding their breath together. Inside, Judge Noelle Whitaker sat steady. Her arm ached in its sling. Her body still carried the weight of the bullets. But her gaze never faltered. After 6 hours, the jury returned. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Even the air felt like it was waiting. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that carried the fate of 2 men, and the message to an entire country. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, the foreperson read, voice trembling but clear, "We find the defendants guilty." A cry ripped through the gallery. Applause erupted. Some wept openly, clutching strangers united by relief. Reporters scrambled to file breaking alerts. Hashtag spiked so fast servers lagged. Hashtag guilty, hashtag justice for Noelle, hashtag 3 bullets. But the foreperson wasn't done. On the charge of civil rights violations under color of law, we find the defendants guilty. That second word landed like thunder. It wasn't just about pulling a trigger anymore. It was about acknowledging what so many had screamed for years, that this wasn't just bad judgment. It was systemic abuse. The defense attorneys slumped. Hannity and Briggs sat frozen, faces drained of color. For the first time, they weren't the ones holding power. Noelle's gavel struck once. Order in the court. Her voice carried through the noise. Justice has been served in this room. But justice cannot end here. She looked straight at the cameras. This verdict is not only about 2 men. It is about a system that armed them with bias, shielded them with silence, and excused them with protocol. That system stands guilty as well. And it will change. The clip exploded across every platform. Millions watched her speak those words in real time. Memes, edits, stitched reactions, people crying, cheering, shaking their heads in disbelief. Commentators said the courtroom had become a revolution. But the impact didn't stop there. Within days, the Department of Homeland Security announced mandatory reviews of airport security nationwide. Lawmakers introduced the Whitaker Transparency Act, requiring all complaints against airport police to be logged publicly. Civil rights organizations seized the momentum, filing lawsuits in multiple states. And Hannity and Briggs? They lost everything. Their badges, their pensions, their reputations. In interviews, former colleagues distanced themselves. One retired officer admitted, "We all knew this day was coming. Just didn't think it'd be a judge who brought it." The irony was bitter. They had fired 3 bullets to silence a woman. Instead, those bullets had ended their own careers. But for Noelle, victory wasn't about them. It was about the people she met in the weeks that followed. At a town hall, a mother pulled her aside, tears in her eyes. "My son saw you on TV," she said. "He asked me if it's safe to fly now. I told him maybe not yet, but safer because of you." At another event, Maya Carter, the young TSA officer who risked recording the shooting, hugged her. "You gave me courage, Judge. You made me believe truth still has a place." Even Tyrese, her young clerk, found himself speaking at rallies, repeating her words. Justice is always unprecedented to those who have avoided it. The movement outgrew her. Hashtags became policies. Protests became panels. Her name became shorthand for accountability. And still, Noelle remained calm, never chasing fame, never claiming credit. One night, weeks later, she walked alone through the same airport where it all began. The tiles had been scrubbed, the checkpoint reorganized, the officers replaced. Travelers moved through the line casually, unaware of the weight that space once carried. A TSA officer recognized her, standing straighter. "Good evening, Judge Whitaker." She nodded politely. "Just traveling tonight." As she handed over her ID, she noticed the officer's hands trembling, not from suspicion but from respect. The ID was returned carefully. No extra questions. No second glance. She moved through security without incident for the first time in years. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't the end of racism or bias or injustice. But it was proof. Proof that the system could be forced to see what it had tried so long to deny. And as she walked toward her gate, She knew those 3 bullets hadn't silenced her. They had given her voice to millions who had been ignored. The officers thought they had ended her story. Instead, they wrote the beginning of their own downfall. And the final irony was this. The man who pulled the trigger lost his badge, his pension, and his career. The woman he tried to silence rewrote the law. That is how justice answered 3 bullets. Beat, pause for dramatic silence and narration. And if this story shook you, don't just scroll past. Subscribe. Because every week we uncover the stories they tried to bury. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next one.